Hello, thanks Martha, and thank you to the BSR for inviting me back. I mean, it's 10 years since I was a resident here. And what I should say is, what you're going to see tonight is a massive evolution of what I was doing at the time. But anybody that knew me at the time will see kernels in there of what I was doing. And I discovered Jakubitsi when I was a resident here, who's somebody that's really returned recently as a passion. He doesn't appear specifically in the work I'm going to show you, but the spirit of cartooning and humour and tragicomedy does. I've got a lot to show you tonight. I'm going to try and keep to time. I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour of recent art history around HIV as a subject in visual art, as a way of talking about some of my doctoral research that I did in 2016. It was completed, and I undertook that in the Faculty of Architecture. And my work is very hybrid and involves a lot of collaborations, and architecture is a good container for the very diverse range of things that I make. Alien Sets Club happened at Beacon P3 in London, and then in Liverpool at Camden Furnace as part of Homotopia Festival. And it was a very large exhibition that I can only give you a taste of. So I'm going to have to be very strict on what I do and don't cover tonight. The project led directly to several other major projects, notably Shonky, the Aesthetics of Awkwardness, which I curated for Hayward Touring. And that will have to wait for another day. And I'm going to talk about CAPSID as well, which grew directly out of Alien Sex Club. And the two projects differ. One is really about activism, and one is really about analogies and about how art science can be done differently. So the scale of the project is epic, and I can talk about the shonkiness through Alien Sex Club actually. I use architecture as a way of taking the curator out of the equation and becoming the curator as a spatial designer. And that becomes very important. And one of the things that we'll touch on is the spaces of sex, between men largely, and the spaces of cruising, which is a broader concept. Now that's also another talk, so I'm going to have to give you a sort of speedy version of that. But the way I'll structure it is the history of HIV as a subject for art, the social and scientific context around HIV, that'll get us all going. Then we'll talk about Alien Sex Club, then CAPSID, and then I'll talk about some next steps in where the work is going. I think what's important to say is that I'm doing art about HIV differently to how other people have done it in the past and are doing it in 2015 and even now. And what is it that I'm doing differently? Well, I'm not doing minimalism, and my outfit is a clue. I'm doing maximalism. And maximalism is not a well-defined term. So one of the projects for tonight's talk is to try and define a little bit better what maximalism is, or could be. And I'd like to suggest that rather than maximalism being the opposite of minimalism, or just about visual luxury, it's more consonant with the idea of the whole is more than the sum of its parts, which is a theory that comes out of complex adaptive systems. So we'll talk a little bit more about what that might mean, but those hopefully give you types of pointers as to where to be focusing your attention. Okay, I'm going to get used to this. Okay, here we go. Strap yourselves in. Okay, this is a painting by Andy Warhol that's just been shown in his big retrospective in the Whitney called AIDS Jeep. And I didn't know about this painting until recently. And I didn't even think that Warhol had directly covered the AIDS crisis. He was obliquely covering it in the final works he was making, The Last Suppers. But one of the things, and I must say this was, things have moved on since 2015, but I think a lot of this is still relevant. There's a contemporary revisiting of the 80s and 90s that frames this discussion around HIV in art. And one main thread is protest art. So this is a still from David Wojnarowicz's film, untitled, or Silence Equals Death, from 1990. Wojnarowicz is a key figure that doesn't really correspond to minimalism as such, but it is an arch exponent of protest art as a way of intervening in the struggle for medication and recognition of the AIDS crisis. And so ACT, which is the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. And this is a sort of pre-internet era of fly posting and agitprop and the use of slogans and graphics as devices. I mean, these are all things that we're very familiar with now, but I think a lot of these groups, like Grand Fury as well, were instrumental in introducing these strategies into the mainstream of art. Now, Keith Haring is a sort of exception to the rule because, again, his work is not minimalist, but it has the sloganeering of ACT UP and Grand Fury, as it has a kind of entertainment value of pop, humour and fun, dare we say it, that is something that I draw on. So these are people that are sort of setting the stall and using their art as a way of tackling power, I suppose. But its general idea and the people on with this is a piece from 1991 called One Day of AZT. AZT being an early HIV drug. And at that point in time, you could be on maybe 40 pills a day. We'll talk about pill burn a bit later on. But this is a series of plastic pills that they made, really to expose the control mechanism that was going on by the regimen of taking pills. I mean, these were experimental treatments at the time relative to now. You could be on one pill a day now if you're HIV positive. What is it really leading to is the emergence of a genre that I'll call queer minimalism. And the arch exponent of this is Felix Gonzalez-Torres, who radically combines post-minimalism, which is the sort of endemic aesthetic approach going on in New York at that moment in time, with narrative, with ideas around cancer and gay relationships and HIV, and conflates these two things into a new genre. Now, and that includes identity politics, and there's a sort of melancholy that gets evoked by these works that becomes the ubiquitous way for addressing these subjects. So we've got on the left-hand side Untitled Loverboy from 1989, which is these are photos from a show that was at the MAC in Belfast in 2014, I think. And then Loverboys, which is candies that get eaten and taken away. But you know, we had our own equivalents, or this is Hammer Butts. This is in the UK. So this is from 1990 called Familiars, and these are glass jars full of chlorine, and the Familiars really refers to the companion of the witch. So there's something alchemical and dangerous about this, and I think this is a really revolutionary way of combining narrative and sculptural form that then influences a younger generation of artists recently. So you have in the UK, this is public material from 2011, and these are vacuum formed plastic slippages, let's say, and then what he refers to as public amenity panelling. So it's the kind of panelling you might find between public toilets. And the materials evoke associations around cruising, and the approach draws directly on that lineage coming out of Felix González Torres. So what I want to really propose is that genres concretize around certain strategies, and Prem Sahib is another good example. So these are 3 pieces. You've got Side On, which is a tiled doorway. Maybe these are the entrances to glory hole booths or rooms within a club, a sex club or a sauna. Night Flies, the exhibition that he had in 2013 on the top right. And then 2 dots. And this 2 dots, which is aluminium and acrylic, it's a shelf with 2 acrylic circles on it. This really refers to a rapid HIV test, in which either, depending on whether it's positive or negative, 1 or 2 dots will emerge. The older artists are also working in this genre, Elmer Green and Dragset being a good example. These are vases filled with the pigments used to coat HIV medicines such as Truvada, A-Tripla and Stridil. And again, this funerary, melancholic approach to the subject dominates. But I wouldn't say it's exclusively around HIV. I think it extends to other subjects. So this is Part MacArthur, whose exhibition at the Chisholm in 2016 really used this queer minimalism approach to talk about disability. And then there's another strain, which is Jordan Wolfson. And this is his Raspberry Poser. This was a video where an HIV, actually very badly represented, we'll come back to the activists around representing viruses later, is jumping through a series of shops in New York, in Soho. And so it sort of conflates the demise of a particular part of Manhattan and the rise of consumer culture with maybe a forgetting or misunderstanding about how the AIDS crisis has progressed. So that's the backdrop, really, to where I was working on Alien Sex Club. So let's give you a bit of the science. So it's shifted slightly since 2015. In 2015, I'm going to use the fancy dot, look. That's what we're looking at. So something else there's a lot of jargon that's actually useful. There's a sexual health way of talking about sex between men as MSM, men who have sex with men, and that's a catch-all for people that don't necessarily define themselves as gay or bisexual, and that becomes very useful in this conversation. But this spike in infections has dropped, and Alien Sex Club was really conceived as a way of intervening in that crisis using art, and that crisis is attributed by the specialists, and we're talking about sexual health clinics, to change cultural changes around drug use, particularly. So access to party drugs such as methadone, GHB, and crystal meth. Now, why do they help increase rates of HIV transmission? Well, if you're HIV positive and you're using those drugs at a party, you might be more likely to slip off your medication, in which case the chances of passing the virus on go up. It leads to the use of other drugs, Viagra. There's a whole phenomenon of crystal dick that we'll come to, which could be its own talk. I'm just breathing talks here. But also, there's a lot of slang generated to justify or glamorize these things. So rather than, using other addict terms, we're talking about slamming. And that the use of language to change the discussion around risk becomes very interesting, and didn't have a place in art at that moment. So part of my project is to bring that language, that slang, across the border. Okay, so testing and this idea of treatment as prevention has become a very important thing. It was really a big topic at the time. So what is treatment as prevention? really this idea that know your HIV status and then do something strategic about that. Now, the policy of people being diagnosed as HIV positive and being put immediately on treatment was just coming in the UK, and that has helped lower rates of transmission, because if your viral load, the amount of virus in your bloodstream, is negligible, you're not going to pass the virus on. And Alison Roger, who I was working with, who's a clinician at the Royal Free, was proving this at the time in a study called Partner, and that's where our collaboration lay. Also, there was a conversation around PEP, which is post-exposure prophylaxis. So if you've been exposed to HIV, you can go on a round of antiretroviral therapy for 72 hours, and that will likely flush out the virus before it gets into the nooks and crannies. But also a revolutionary idea that has really changed everything since I was working on this project, which is PrEP. And that's the idea that if you're HIV negative, you take an antiretroviral tablet daily or around times of sexual risk, and the drugs are in your bloodstream already. And this is an alternative to condom use. So there's a lot of discussion around condom fatigue, particularly among men that had lived through the long part of the AIDS crisis, because safe sex had been the main preventative method. So really our repertoire of ways of preventing HIV have expanded. So this is an AZT pill made by Boaz Wellcome in the 90s, and this is really shifted. You know, Truvada, which is the generic brand name for PrEP, is not available in the UK. I don't know what the situation is in Italy, it'll be different. But there's been ways to make it cheap to acquire via the internet. And that has, in big cities in the UK, that has really changed how rates of transmission are going. I'm just pinpointing things. It's like I'm pinning the mouse down ready to cut into it. What I want to introduce you to just before I plot out the maximalism is this idea of a life cycle of a virus. So we'll prove later on that this is out of date, but an HIV virus particle will bond with a host cell and trick entry, pushing a capsid in. A capsid is a protein shown inside the virus. A retrovirus has two RNA strands that it weaves into a DNA strand. It does everything backwards, that's why it's called a retrovirus. A common cold would have a DNA strand in it. It's a sneak. Think of HIV as a sneak. The drugs will work on the assumption that the capsid breaks up in the cytoplasm of the cell, and somehow the RNA transcribes into a DNA strand and gets to the nucleus and reprograms the cell to make more virus, exporting that and budding with a piece of the surface of the host cell to make many more viruses. The treatments work on three parts in this life cycle to prevent the virus from developing, and that's what people on HIV meds will be dealing with on a daily basis in their bodies. What we'll come to in CAPSID is how this diagram is actually out of date, but what's important is the drugs don't need to be any better than this, they do the job, and that's an interesting debate that's going on. Okay, this was HIV in 2015, and this is a good way for you to see how I think. Okay, what have we not talked about? Okay, so there's a discussion around the spaces of sex and cruising, and that includes digital spaces. They're constructed in very similar ways to real spaces in terms of rooms and compartments and how things are put out. AIDS is not a big problem in the UK now. There are still AIDS deaths. They're associated with very specific communities generally, but overall, the point at which HIV gets to AIDS, which is, if untreated, about 10 years after infection, there's a drop in infection, and then it gradually builds back up again. The body fights it off, but it's still there, lurking. Access to all these other ways of testing have really changed things, as has antiretroviral therapy, its effectiveness, its cost, the reduction in that, and the reduction in pill burden. So if you were on 42 pills a day, say, you'd have to eat with one, not with another, drink with this one, have this one at 4 p.m. Your whole day was structured around that. It was very visible. It was very hard to disguise that. HIV has been privatised through this process of pill burden reduction, that it can be invisible. And that has pros and cons because it makes the subject less visible to others, which may be a way of fighting stigma of having. We'll come back to that. Okay, chemsex we've covered. So there's also this idea around other infections. Hepatitis C being an almost bigger problem than HIV in the UK now. And I think this is an important zone. So alien sex comes very much about risk and how we, as human beings, enjoy risk, deal with risk, or risk aversity. Art and architecture can do anything to intervene in that. So I'll just introduce a bit more about Maximalism. So two people have really talked about Maximalism in very different ways. Dundee Fields, on the left, who's an artist that I worked with on Shonky as well, actually, and he proposes that Maximalism is minimalism with a plus plus plus, which I think is sort of getting there. Robert Pincus-Witten, who I'm talking about in the context of David Sally, sort of American or trans-avant-garde painting, he talks about Maximalism in his book, Post-Minimalism into Maximalism. He suggests this idea of the palimpsest, which is a poetic term, which really talks about the layering up of images and erasures on top of one another. But really what he's talking about is a kind of figurative reaction against post-minimalism, which still doesn't do the trick, in my mind, as to what Maximalism is. So Melanie Mitchell, who's a scientist who works with AI and learning from DNA as to how we can better improve artificial intelligence systems, how we can generate living organisms, which are one definition of a complex adaptive system. What I'm going to suggest this evening really is that my work is a complex adaptive system, and also that probably an artistic practice is a complex adaptive system, in which a complex arrangement of parts can accumulate to a variety and chaos, i.e. there are unexpected effects. But this can be explained because the thing is decomposable and there are hierarchies within it. And this could be an interesting way of opening up other ways of thinking. Okay, bang, we're here. What I'd like to say, first of all, with this bit, is that graphic design plays a big role in these projects. Because they're so big, they need things like architecture, design approaches to rally them together. So the graphic identity for this project was designed by Ponto Studio. And so Alien System has many guises. It had a guise as a doctoral research, where it was called Alien Sex Club, educating audiences about continuing rates of HIV transmission using art and design. And I should say I undertook that by practice and writing. Okay. That diagram that I showed you a while back about a web of interconnected problems transposes itself quite neatly onto a cruise maze. What is a cruise maze? This is a diagram of sweatbox in Soho, which is actually having a renovation at the moment. It probably doesn't look like this anymore. This is one floor. A cruise maze is an idea within a space of sex, a sauna or a sex club or a chat room, where you can get lost for a while. And the layout of a sex club is a convenient motif for me to talk about the interconnected web of problems around HIV, a way of representing it. And it's a spatial type that has the capacity to talk about sexual risk, sexual health, behaviour, and the history of cruising. So these two things dovetail with each other. Is it a cruise maze? Well, look, you've got all these corridors that you go around, and you can jump in the sauna for a while, and then you can hang out here. And these are just the right width so that somebody brushes up against you and it encourages intimacy. And these are all things that are very explored. And they're also fallacies, really, because it's not a maze. You know, actually, it would be brilliant if it was Hampton Court Maze made as a sex club. Oh my God, but nobody's going to invest in that. But it's this sort of aphrodisiacal idea within the gay imagination, potentially not confined to the gay imagination, that I've wanted to literalise. And others have looked at this. So this is a piece of Tom Burr's 42nd Street structures. And this is a small box with a model of an adult bookstore, which is a type that maybe does exist in Rome, actually. It doesn't exist in the UK. And each of these is a viewing booth to watch pornography in, purportedly to purchase it, but it's actually a way of having sex with people in a non-public space. It's sort of all these spaces are kind of interstices between public and private, and commercial and not. So he was looking back in the 90s at the spaces of cruising and how they were structured. And that then informed models that I was beginning to make, where I literalised mazes that I found in the history of maze design that I thought could become good clubs for my alien sex club. And you'll start to see motifs appear that make it into the show. And these mazes, a maze I should say, is a path that has multiple prongs. It's tree-like. You can get lost in a maze, but a labyrinth has one path, and a labyrinth is much more associated with a spiritual journey. You'll find a labyrinth in a church on the floor laid in the marble. So one of my questions, and this wasn't a research question, this was just a question, was could you intervene the rates of HIV transmission using a labyrinth? Is there a cruising labyrinth where you could sort of spatially reduce HIV rather than using a drug? But then it seemed quite boring. Maybe a cruising labyrinth is really dull. So this is a computer model of what Alien Sex Club was going to become when it was in our peak of P3, which for those of you that don't know it, is an absolutely enormous space where they tested parts of the Channel Tunnel. It's a sort of engineering vault, like the turbine hall at the Tate Modern. So it needs serious consideration and a bigger budget than I had, so I had to find sort of gestures that could intervene in it. A lot of what I do involves working with software and materials that I'm not an expert in or not virtuous with, and that's very important because, and that's a shonkiness, we'll come back to that, but that willingness to be the amateur at something is very purposeful and helps generate things. Okay, I'll give you a few shots of Alien Sex Club. This was looking through the PrEP curtain, so you all know what PrEP is now. So this curtain immunised you as you went through it, so you could have as much fun as you wanted in the club. And then, what else is there? I'm going to really use the pointer. This is where you could get an HIV test. This is where you could get your tarot read. This is a series of Pilgrim paintings featuring a Caravaggio boy, a Roman native, a Roman character. And this is a whole section called Jalaberry's Grave, which is a series of coffins I made for the gay dead. There was a coffin for Lee Bowery, a big coffin, and there was a coffin for Kenny Everett, a smaller coffin. And it was an absolutely sprawling thing. That was one section, and then you went underneath into a much more maze-like section. So this is a book of paintings that's about, I think it opens to about 1.50 meters wide. And there's sort of two building types. There's a type that sits on the floor and goes up, and there's a type that hangs from the ceiling and goes down. And this is honeycomb board, and this is canvas. And the provisional nature of the making is very important. This is not a heavy build. This is a very adaptable build, and you've also got different painting types. So these are digitally printed paintings. That's Dame Edna, who's having a Truvada trance. There's different registers that get mixed up between the digital and analog, and the exhibition as a whole really corresponds to the idea that more is different. And that's another tenet of complex adaptive systems. So it's not more is more, it's more is different. That it's all going to come back to phylogenetic trees, really. As I make more work, it generates more possibilities, which makes more work, which generates more possibilities. And actually, there's an editing process that goes on, that the willingness to let the work breathe and expand becomes important and liberates the work to move forward. I should point out that the wall paintings, this is a dolphin. This is a dolphin from the Palace of Knossos in Crete, another labyrinth reference. You'll see that different patterns repeat throughout, and that's a way of joining together things that aren't connected. And I'm a joiner together of things and people that aren't connected. But pattern making persists and has actually grown as an interest. I should also say that the sex club is specifically different to the sauna. The sauna is premised on the idea of health and well-being and water, and the sex club is exclusively about meeting people for sex. And it's a privatised space. It's not a commercial space. You don't buy sex, but you buy entrance to the space. And that permits certain behaviours to go on. And it allows the transgression to be staged, and that's a very important thing. So, you know, look, at P3 it was okay. When it went, and things were layered up in different ways, you could project on top of some drawings, and there were very unconventional ways of staging, and sort of impurities actually. Things were overlapped on top of each other, amongst one another. Curatorial hierarchies were questioned. And there were awkward hands. So this is a series of cardboard walls. And this is queer, imbalanced, asymmetrical, deliberately poorly crafted, approximate, stand-in, disruptive, ugly, funny. And so these cardboard walls are joined together with zip ties, and then they have other things sunk into them. It's also a very cheap way of building something, and it's a very environmentally friendly way of building a thing on this scale rather than using plastics, which did actually become a concern. I'm not that virtuous, but that was a discussion. This is a film called Strategic Positioning, projected on the back of a pair of glory hole booths, and there's a sauna seating area that you can sit and watch it. And the term strategic positioning is this idea that you choose which sexual position you'll have based on risk of HIV, whether you want to encourage or discourage it. And all of this language, I think, was so rich and needed a home. So the spatial cruising typologies become devices for staging these artworks. Inside the Glory Hole booths, there's two videos, and there's two characters, a puppet and a CGI head, shouting slang at each other, a kind of Polari, which is quite funny. We're in Italy, because that word supposedly is a mangled version of Polare. But what would be a good Polari? Oh, look at the Omi Poloni. Look at the lallies on the Omi Poloni. So that's look at the legs on the gay man. And Polari is a slang that has died out of necessity, that was prevalent in the 50s, and it was a way of using certain codified words to signify that you were gay, but using an English grammar. And maybe the slang that we use on Grindr or in Tinder is the extension of that. Okay, hospitality is a big part of this project. So there's fortune telling, that's Barbara Truvada, she'll read your tarot. There's a gin bar, this is the Chem Jester, and there's free rapid HIV testing provided by Terence Higgins Trust. And these three live elements, combined with the sounds that were going on, were allowing the work to attack you from all sides. Or the other way of saying that is, there were a lot of entry points into the work. And that use of generosity to the viewer really is a big shift against the minimalist approach. That these humans and the generous and hospitable approach to the work took allowed discussions about risk to take place that maybe couldn't have otherwise. So there's a use of black humour, tragicomedy, which are devices within that earlier work too, that stage differently. And the show has mutated every time it's moved, and that is absolutely exemplary of what I mean by maximalism. So when the show went to Liverpool, we took the pug virus. This is an imaginary virus that spreads pugs. This was placed in the Walker Art Gallery, and the lighting at the iteration of the show in Liverpool allowed for it to be much more club-like, so we could have blue light, because it was a club space and it was freezing. It was November, it was absolutely freezing. So what I'm saying is, Alien Sex Club is a set of parts, hundreds of parts, that can be spread around and reorganised, and you can get different alien sex clubs out of it. And that's a different way of thinking about things. There's not one version of it. It's infinitely rearrangeable, just like a DNA strand. So this is a Canadian sex capsule at Hull during City of Culture. So a much miniaturised version of the show, but it's still the show because it has all the genetic traits of the show, but it's on a different order of magnitude. So you can take a slice or one piece of the show and it's still the show, or you can have the whole of the show and it's the show. And that applied when the show got restaged on a tenth of its scale at the Welcome Collection last year as part of Somewhere in Between. And there was a lavish budget to build with MDF. And that proved, we'll talk about that over dinner, but there was a problem there. That was where Shonky could have helped us. That for the amount of visitors they had, we had to build in a different way. But we were able to build a brilliant other version of it. So I don't have to revisit Alien Sex Club for a while, but those ideas are carrying on into other projects. So I'm going to rush through this section, which is to say, what you've just seen is made up of building blocks. And this idea, the whole is more than the sum of its parts. For each of these images, there's a series of 20, 30, 10. I work serially. This is not chaotic. This is not random. It's systematic. A conversion party is this idea that you go to acquire or offer HIV, depending on whether you're HIV positive or negative. Why would anyone do that? It might be the biggest fear. So it might be an idea to somebody to want to get the virus just to get it over and done with, and have dealt with their biggest fear. But more importantly, there is a mythology within HIV, true or not. It's true. It's quite easy to find websites devoted to this, of the bug chaser and the gift giver. And what Alien Sex Club is also is a sort of mythology of HIV. So the bug chaser is the person that wants to get the virus, and the gift giver is the person offering it. And I'm fully aware of how dark and problematic those things are, but I'm just presenting them. So this says, Gulliver of the House of MacGuffin is chased through the immunity door by Shitty Cunstone. Shitty Cunstone's a character I've used a lot. These are actually the drawings for the space, for how to design the show. This is a Stargate. Gulliver, we'll come back to Gulliver soon actually, but he evolved as a character that walks on the graves of his ancestors. And so this idea that you can approach the show in a superficial way or in a very deep way is not didactic. You can choose your version. Ooh, we've got a song.
We went walking over Jalaberry's grave. We went dancing on the little labyrinth of the little hill. We made candles in the little lights, demarcating the route to fellow passers-by. We waved at ships off the shore. We went walking over Jalaberry's grave. We were dancing on the little labyrinth.
I won't put you through the whole album. There are two albums. There's Alien Sex Club and there's Post-Polari. Jalaberry's grave is a site in Chilham in Kent, a Neolithic burial mound, and it was believed that, God, there's archaeologists here, they're going to tell me I'm wrong, but I'll put this out anyway. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. What was more important was that I used this story as a building block for the show. This idea that you would walk on the graves to encounter the dead. I thought we could walk on Kenny Everett's grave and invoke him, and that could be a wonderful way of addressing the AIDS crisis. So Jalaberry's grave features throughout. This is from the book of paintings that we saw. This is Sin Centre. Sin Centre was a project by Archigram, and so there's lots of different references that take in different directions. We've got a series of pills made of phloem, which is a kind of crappy material you use for like children's projects. This is a marrow in a hat, and you could borrow the marrow and take it around the show with you like a child, a baby. And we only lost one marrow, and it got stolen by a child and returned the next day. And this is a 3D printed virus, imaginary virus. This one's called Semen Demon, and that was a screen name of somebody I had chatted with online a long time ago, and I was like, I'm having that. And these are ways of embedding the work with realism, I suppose, but in the most odd way. Okay. Sometimes I kill things in the work by dealing with them. I've used Caravaggio's Boy with a Basket of Fruit a lot in my work. It's also a reference to a painting that Julian Schnabel did featuring that painting. But he became an emblem within the show, a kind of coda that joined lots of things together. His basket emptied or loaded up with different things. Condoms, blood platelets, croissants in cock rings, my own HIV virus particles and pills. And in different iterations of the show, these have been spread throughout. It's a big discovery that we'll expand on, but this is an HIV CAPSID. I'm going to leave that one there and come back to it. And this is one of the painting types. So this is about 5 meters wide There's 20 of these. This one's called Labyrinth as Prophylactic. Animation has become a big part of what I do. This is working in Maya, Autodesk Maya. This is a pill passing through a portal, and became part of a performance that I did called Trance Time. What I'm really establishing here is that there is no medium specificity. Overall, I would say the work is pictorial. It comes out of painting culture, but it uses other materials and media to do that work. I'm going to give you a little bit of video.
Come on then, let's go home. You go in and there's a sort of changing area here, and you check your clothes, and depending on the night you can be naked or you're always wearing your shoes.
So this is a video called Courtship Disorder, which was an idea put forward by John Money that there might be some sort of Freudian problem that causes you to act out your sexual convulsions in a particular way. It seemed very interesting, this idea of a courtship disorder and a way of explaining what pleasure could be taken in risk. I'm just giving you little bits of this. This is all online if you care to look at it. This is a video called Crystal Dick.
Met this starlight today. Said it was Hayward Tina. I never met her.
Because you'll just start singing it. It's really annoying, catchy. I've got to speed up. This is the tarot set that came with Alien Sets Club at 2 scales. A normal box scale and a huge play your cards right scale. And this imagery spread through in analog and digital form. And what I want to say here is that meaning is formed out of meaninglessness in my work, as it may be in all our work. And that can spring from repetition and variation of symbols, and in the same way that life can spring from arrangements of amino acids. And these can cause what Douglas Hofstadter would call strange loops to form, and the work can come alive. And it's actually not, it doesn't mean anything, but it suddenly begins to mean everything. And that's how these complex adaptive systems work. Okay, and these are the 4 symbols that permeate throughout. The bug chaser, the gift giver, the serra sorter, and the barebacker. So the serra sorter is somebody that is sifting their sexual partners based on HIV status. And the barebacker is somebody that's having sex without condom or without prevention. Okay, we're going to move on now. We're transitioning to CAPSID. This is the banner that we took on the Gay Pride March before Alien Sex Club. And, you know, all of what I've just shown you did have a social role in some way to try and intervene in the discussion around HIV. So there's an activist mentality within it. And that's there in other projects, but it's not quite the same in CAPSID. So we've got a different graphic system here. This is the logo for CAPSID. This was designed by Claire Bruce, who I've been working with recently. This is a virus particle of an HIV. And like I said before, it contains a capsid which has 2 RNA strands and various enzymes that are needed to transcribe those RNA strands into a DNA. This is a computer model made by a group in Chicago by Klaus Schulten and Juan Perilla, who I was working with in Alien Aesthetics and came across this work. What's important to notice here is these green pentamers, pentagonal proteins, there's exactly 12 of them. So a simple virus might be a football shape. It would have pentamers and hexamers. The rest of these hexamers, there's about 250 of them. But this morphology is very peculiar, and Greg, who I'm working with, and people working in this field, think that this is a shape that can just hold itself together long enough to do what it needs to do. But this is something that was just being worked out. Took me down another path. That's me and Greg. Greg's dressed up as a scientist. He never wears a lab coat. He also put those little things on there to look a bit more arty. And then I dressed up as an artist. And I had made these capsids out of cardboard, and he was very surprised that anybody would have bothered to do that, because the scientist would always work in a computer. And this has been a project that we worked on for the last 2 years. And I've been an artist in residence in his lab, making posters. There was actually somebody that infected themselves with HIV in Rome in a lab that had not been doing their experiments correctly, and we decided that we should make some posters for the lab that didn't look like the generic lab aesthetic. So, what are you transfecting? That's a longer conversation. But there's a whole culture of visual forms in the lab setting that can be disrupted. And we've worn ones. These are costumes from my film that we'll talk about. But embedding myself in a broader discussion about art and science and about creativity has really been very generative. And this is a collaboration that goes in both ways. We can help each other out. Okay, so these objects that I was making really led into discussions of Greg was starting to, I'm going to tell you about what HIV does. Here we go. The blue is blood. So we've got this is the best infection story we can tell at the moment. So in real life, lots of virus particles would latch onto the host cell and trick entry and push capsids in. Lots of capsids would die. The capsid is transcribing using those hexamers and pentamers, which are actually portals to take in nucleotides from the cytoplasm to fuel this transcription process. And that's the trick. It does everything once it's inside the cell. And that's a way of evading the innate sensing mechanism of the cell. So the cell is programmed to detect any foreign genetic material and kill it. But the successful capsid will co-opt certain particles within the cell to cloak it and disguise it and smuggle it to the nuclear pore, and it squirts the viral DNA into the nucleus and write that into the DNA of the cell to program the production of more virus. So my cartoon version of this story becomes a useful way of building an iconography for the project and telling a simple version of it. New viral DNA, RNA is exported from the cell, and a special RNA strand cuts up bits and pieces that we need to make a new virus particle, hexamers, pentamers, different proteins and enzymes, and then they all get packaged into a new particle. They take a bit of the surface of the cell with them and bud, and this matures into a new capsid and goes on to infect. I mean, we're talking hundreds. This is the simple version. But this story of cloaking, of deception, of evasion, of hostility and hospitality, and of the way the cell and the virus work together and have evolved to work together is at the core of what Greg and I have been doing. What's this? Oh. This is some virtual reality work I've been doing, where I build CAPSIDs in Tilt Brush and start to put disco RNA strands in them. And this is a sort of emerging new technology for what I'm using. So that life cycle story becomes the tale within CAPSID. These are costumes for the film that I made called The Virus Walks Into a Bar. This is the doorman for the film. I started to, people were saying to me, what is CAPSID? And I said, imagine a virus walks into a bar, and then I thought we actually need to make the film, which was a sort of hybrid of Coronation Street, Twin Peaks, and the Teletubbies. And what I'm showing you here is in reverse. I'm showing you the parts, and then I'll show you the whole at the end. So we've got these fists with these, maybe they're enzymes, I don't know what they are. There's a series of paintings called the cytoplasms, and the cytoplasm is a highly organised space within the cell. What I should say is that this way of working serially enables me to lift analogies from the science and transpose them onto the art, and one can talk about the other. And each medium that I'm working in, this is a series called the innate sensing mechanisms. Each medium is really an environment for the work to evolve in. So in complex adaptive systems, there's this idea of a proliferation of niches. So if painting is one environment, and sculpture is another, and VR is another, and song is another, and costume is another, I can take an image and place it in each of those things, and it will evolve slightly differently in each one. And then I can bring them back together, and then they can have a conversation with one another. With these paintings, I found myself tricking the painting to accept things that I hadn't made and that I didn't know whether I could appropriate by using patterning to suppress the immune system of the painting, a bit like you would use an immune suppressant drug after a transplant operation. So this was a new way of thinking about collage for myself. This is a whole series of drawings to show you how it looks when you do the whole thing. These are small, these are tiny. But pattern has become a way of bonding things together. Big silk screens. This is 2.5 meters wide. This is called the allostery process. And what should I say about the allostery process? Allosteric effects are ways that chemical processes can happen and trigger movements within bonding on a molecular level. And all of this language becomes very exciting for me to use as source material. Lithographs that take the cell as a space to explore, and that's smaller than it really is for me. That's 5 meters wide. And this is a series of paintings called the cofactors. And I talked about the cofactors in that life cycle. Really, each one of these series becomes a point on the life cycle story that can then make up the installation later. What you'll see here is different images from Staffordshire pottery, well, it's not Topolino, but it's a sort of Spanish mouse that's pulling apart a grapefruit with his friend. Breakfast time logos from 80s BBC television, all mushed together with cross-hatching and printing using foam that you would pack paintings with. And it's a sort of yoking together of opposites or unlikely compatriots. This is that point when the capsid meets the nuclear core and breaks apart is called uncoating. And this is a big metal sheet steel sculpture that maybe talks about what that might look like. This is a book of paintings. I'm just going to run through these. Little gouaches, watercolours, more than palimpsest drawings, prints. So this work just proliferates. big paintings on paper. That's a Triskelion with virus particles. And this is stuff in its own right, but it also becomes, this is a budding painting. This is a painting that's budding, it's budding another painting. It's been infected with a painting and it's made another painting. And this is we can't watch the whole thing, and I'm nearly there. This is the trailer for A Virus Walks into a Bar. And what you can see now is that all this stuff gets collapsed in a very playful way. And I'm going to introduce one other idea, which is this idea of jump in the DNA. And in a DNA strand, there's a lot of non-coding information that is highly debated. That in my practice, there's a lot of non sequiturs, other imagery, things that isn't the main theme. And what I would say is that's an opportunity for things to mutate, new alleles to form, new combinations, either within a work or within works when they're combined into an installation. So we've got the animation embedded in the wallpaper, and then we go through into a room where all the work on paper is laid on the floor, partly out of convenience, because it's so much of it, and then there's a very thin layer of plastic. It's not perspex, but it's got that quality to it. Stuck down the dance floor tape, and you have to wear little booties to walk on the floor. And these ways of flipping horizontal and vertical, which in games and painting became exciting ways of stimulating the audience. And it's a fun show, it's an entertaining show, and that's really important anyway, but it's also really important given the subject, which could be a heavy one. There's a lot of windows that I've opened up in the space where you can see through from the street, and these are further examples of hospitality because they offer a hand to the viewer before they come to the work. Oh yeah, there were lots of these posters that I incorporated into the paintings which were made in Manchester, so we brought them into the show. So, you know, each place this has travelled, it has mutated according to the architecture, and that's an important tenet of maximalism. Okay, we're sort of moving gears now, and I'm pleased that Jean Cameron is here tonight from Paisley, because I'm working on a new project that grows out of CAPSID, which is a collaboration with Paisley in Scotland and Delhi in India. And it's really going to be talking about how Paisley is a form that has travelled and mutated, and it really grows out of the image virus project that General Idea made, which was turning Robert Indiana's love into AIDS, and this idea, which we are all very familiar with now with memes, that actually virology can tell us even more about how images travel and how they mutate when they travel, which goes further than the General Idea thing. So I'm in the very early stages of developing this project, which will happen over the next 3 years. And this is a painting from a series called The Shoe People, Paisley, He's a Paisley with a shoe person in it, at the top, Sergeant Major. And I'm really beginning to research what is Paisley. So it's this teardrop form that has a tail, and it can be lots of things. It's a container within which to pour and pour out meaning. But we're going to be looking at the links between industry and infection, and how cultural transmission and cultural appropriation happens, and how working between these two places and sharing information can talk about global and local culture simultaneously. And these are sketchbooks that I'm working in at the moment to really plot out what are the parameters of Paisley, which can be very, very lavish and complicated and have lots of layers, and it may be related to a leaf, and it may be related to a celery, or a tadpole, or a mango, or there's lots of different names for it depending on where you're from. And also it's very much associated with weaving, or with the textile industry, or printing, that I'm moving it into painting and allowing it to mutate in another zone. And another way I'm allowing it to mutate is by working with another member of Greg's lab called Chris Monique, who is a statistician, and we're beginning to develop a sort of evolutionary way of speeding up the evolution, a sort of mathematical way of speeding up the evolution of the virus, of the Paisley virus, by plotting it onto grids and developing software for it. So it'll be a very different collaboration with the lab, and it'll open up new partnerships. Okay, that brings me to the end. We're going to have a blackboard. I mean, what I want to say, and we're nearly up on time, is that there's an anti-HIV science when it's delivered in the context of art. And this is partly, and this is what I've learned, this is partly to do with the entertaining way in which the subject is presented. The audiences for my work are not art audiences exclusively, far from it. And the presentational modes that I use refresh the discourse around the subject, and that may be cyclical. I'm not arguing exclusively for a maximalism. I think this is part of a bigger cycle. HIV is useful not just as an activist tool. Viruses and evolutionary virology can be applied as analogies to a number of cultural and social and non-scientific questions. And I'm a great believer that we should all be looking more at viruses and DNA and using that more. I'm applying humour and gesturing and non sequiturs onto complex, difficult and often taboo subjects, and that opens them up in new ways to be discussed. I think most importantly for me though, the maximalism is under research, and this idea of complex adaptive systems can really help us all think about how we work, and in an era in which DNA is so understood and so exciting. So I hope that made some kind of sense, but if not, I'm available for questions. Thank you.